I have been really looking forward to today's talk because we are going to be talking about race and racism in higher education. And to me, this topic is really fitting for the series because my frustrations about racism and the lack of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic researchers in physics are what inspired me to start the Challenges and Changes series. And I'm so excited to be able to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Jason Arday. He is an assistant professor in sociology at Durham University, and he is a leading expert on the study of race and education. Now, I first came across Jason's work in a BBC News article about the lack of PhD funding awarded to Black students in the UK, and I knew we here at Oxford Physics needed to hear about his research and see what we can learn from it and how we can be better. He's done extensive work on the importance of decolonizing the curriculum, on how racism persists in higher education, and how racism affects the mental health of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic researchers. His work is so important for us all, regardless of our research interests, and I think it's incredibly fitting for the series. And I'm so happy he agreed to come and talk to us today. So Jason, welcome, albeit virtually, to the Oxford Physics Department, and thank you so much, and I'm so excited to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Alex, and I can't tell you how much it means to be here. And you know, the great thing about doing this work is that you get to meet some pretty cool people, and I'd hold you very highly amongst them. So just thank you so much for having me here. It really means a lot. Massive thanks to Catherine and to Anna, who are doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes as well. And probably most importantly, good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone keeping? Is everyone well? I guess I can't tell because I can't see everyone, but I'm just hoping that everyone's okay. So that's good. Thanks, Honor. That's great. So, I mean, we're in a really interesting situation right now. I think there are several things that kind of come to mind when we think of race and racism, institutionally, structurally, but particularly within higher education. And I think the thing that comes to mind at the moment, or the word that I kind of think about with all of these kind of tenets associated with racism, and even, you know, the sad murder of Sarah Everard, is vigilance at the moment. I think vigilance is a huge thing. I think there's been a complacency that has become commonplace, has become part of the normal orthodoxy in terms of how we socialize, how we integrate society, where people are increasingly becoming victimized, demonized, they're having their lives placed at risk. And I think for across the intersection, this is troubling. I think when we think specifically about race and racism, and we think about how intersection works and how for a person of color, how they traverse society whilst navigating issues around class, sexuality, gender, race, obviously, disability, religion, we kind of see all of those, we kind of see it as almost this kind of, I guess, in many respects, a process that kind of scaffolds on top of one or the other. And I think what's been increasingly hard is for people to metabolize that we have these institutionally and structurally racist structures. And I think, to be honest, a couple of years ago was a non-argument, you know, so, and, you know, these are some of the retorts to the non-argument. We're not as bad as America. All lives matter. Black lives don't just matter, all lives matter. If the percentage of the UK populace, according to the 2011 census, is 14% are made up from a BAME background, and there are only 4% that are from a Black background, then actually having a wide representation in higher education of 13% is not so bad. Now, I guess the juxtaposition to this is that within the UK, we have a migration every year of around 1 million students around the UK. And since 2003, we've seen numbers vehemently increase in terms of number of Black and ethnic minority people going to university. Now, of that 1 million students, as of 2015, just over half of that are now from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds. 2/3 of that half will go on to postgraduate study, and then we're seeing that chasm, that slippage in the pipeline, which has been really, really huge. So in other words, Black people are applying and Asian and minority people are applying for PhD studentships. But as we know, 30,000 PhD studentships were awarded in 2018, 2019. and only 30 were awarded to Black Caribbean students. So that's out of 30,000. And that was part of the kind of groundbreaking research that was led by Paulette Williams of Leading Roots, which I was fortunate enough to be a part of, with Chantel Lewis and Suki Barth. And there's some really kind of interesting tenets around that, because when we presented that research to OFS, there was a reluctance to accept that information is made inaccessible. There aren't opportunities for BAME people to progress throughout the academy. And actually, we have these inherent structures that in many ways have been designed to ensure that Black and ethnic minority people don't progress throughout the academy. And, you know, I myself don't have a benign obsession with statistics and numbers, but very often I'm in a situation where I have to paint the picture. You know, I have this canvas and I have to illustrate to people just how bad things really are, just to get a perspective of where we need to be going. So 20,000 professors in the UK, or just over 20,000 professors in the UK. 15,500 are white male, 4,500 are white women, and 35 are Black women. And you have a further 90 that are Black men. So we're talking about less than 1% of the professoriate in the UK are Black. And when you bear in mind the migration of BAME people in higher education, you would think the numbers would actually be more than that, because a significant amount go on to postgraduate study. Now, the thing that I always kind of find interesting is when we look at career trajectories, one of the things that's always really interesting is marrying these trajectories against the intersection. So, for example, if you're a woman of color, what would your salary earnings be if you had the same qualification, same skill set, same publication rate in comparison to your white counterpart? Now, if we just take the Russell Group as an example, I was fortunate enough to do a study with the BBC in 2018, where we undertook a study of the pay differentials between academics by ethnicity within the Russell Group. So the average salary for a white academic in the Russell Group is £52,000. The average salary for a Black academic in the Russell Group is £38,000, and the average salary from anyone from an Arab background in the academy is £32,000. So we're looking at a differential of £14,000, even though many BAME academics will be as qualified, will be as capable, will have met the criteria, but it's about the structures that are interwoven within our progressive and in many respects discriminatory and systemic cultures within the academy. And so, like I said, it does become really important to think of those numbers, because I guess we kind of live on this carousel of numbers. There's lots of numbers and statistics flying around, but the actual only narrative that matters is that BAME people are significantly disadvantaged in the academy because of the color of their skin. And the centrality of whiteness makes it an issue for people of color to be subjugated and to be disadvantaged in this way. Now, for me, I always say we can engage in mature debates about this, and mature debates about this, in my opinion, don't involve statistics. I should never have to really paint out statistics. In other words, if a person of color says that they are experiencing racism, why do we neutralize or challenge or question that experience? The Meghan Markle interview, for example. There's no irony lost on any person of color that a white middle-class man would question whether a woman of color has encountered racism or not. In fact, not question, would abstract deny that that person has encountered racism. Would make a claim that actually they have spoken about how racism, along with other compounding factors, was a factor in potentially engaging in suicidal thought or a change of psychological state. But interestingly, the centrality of whiteness allows white people to always question or neutralize the experiences of people of color when it comes to experiencing racism. So when we think about how people talk about racism, there is kind of this idea of, and again, I always come back to the rejection of the idea that people are encountering racism. You're playing the race card. It's got nothing to do with race. I think you're being slightly hypersensitive. We live in a colorblind society, you know, where we're postmodern. We're not living in a racialized society anymore. I think sometimes people just look for racism in anything, you know, and it's really interesting because I guess, you know, the paradox to that is that when we're talking about the white working class, we're not looking for race in that. And what's interesting is the white working class as a narrative is extremely important, and it occupies the center ground on its own because of its level of importance, and rightly so. When we talk about race, race has always been on the periphery, and the minute it occupies the political center, we then have to compromise that and balance it by saying, what about the white working class? Now, it's this idea that they both can't go hand in hand. And I find that really interesting because one is clearly positioned as more important than the other, but it's this kind of, again, neutralization of racism in that it shouldn't be a priority issue. Now, when we think of how people navigate racism on an everyday basis, this is the reality of what it is. Most people, if not all people who negotiate racism, they're not thriving, they're surviving. They're trying to survive in an institutionally and structurally racist society. Now, I think that becomes really important, all of that. I'm yet to meet a person of colour in my 35 years of life who has ever said to me, I want to encounter racism. So, you know, it's a birthright almost, if you want to look at it like that. You are a person of colour, you come out of the womb, and you can almost guarantee that you will experience some form of racism. If you're fortunate, maybe once. If you're unfortunate, it'll be every single day of your life, and for many people it is. The argument should be you shouldn't even have to experience it in the first place. Once is bad enough. Once is as bad as a million times. But it then becomes beholden on white people to think about how we reconceptualize allyship and anti-racist endeavor. And for me, a huge part of that is thinking about how we disrupt patterns of racism, how we disrupt complicities in racism, and how we look to center the voices of ethnic minority people, people of color. That becomes hugely, hugely important because very often people of color don't occupy spaces and they don't have equal agency in being able to challenge instances of racism. So it's about how it's not so much, yes, you can talk about the giving up of privilege, but I think there's a central argument to how people use privilege and how they use it to disrupt cycles of racial discrimination in favor of creating an intersectionally egalitarian equal space. And that for me becomes hugely important. I just want to kind of finish on one thing. I think when we think about race and racism, there is a huge underestimation of the impact this has on people's psychological well-being. I have interviewed, I think, over 400 people of color, over a 5-year period, doing a lot of work on race and working a lot in terms of around race and mental health. And what's always really interesting is the strategies people use to get through a day at work. And what they always say is work doesn't exhaust me. It's the circumnavigating and the landmines that exist in relation to racism. You know, I'm always not too far from walking on this landmine of racism. So an example of this might be the racial microaggression. An example of this may be watching your white counterparts progress whilst you have the same experience, the same qualifications, the same levels of competence, but you're not progressing in the same way. It's watching your voice be in a dominant white space and not having that voice heard or acknowledged, but having your white counterpart say the same thing and have that acknowledged as gospel. And that is a potent thing. The reason why I provide that prelude to go into a context is because I think that I've interviewed people from across many subject disciplines. And, you know, even when we think about this particular person I interviewed was from a STEM background. And when we think about, physics or, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, there's a really interesting narrative around the fact that there are not a lot of BAME people in that particular academic discipline. Actually, if you was to break it down by percentage, there are more BAME people that study some STEM subjects that go on from A level and go on to higher education and through to postgraduate than there are in any other academic discipline. I think commonly there's this thought that most BAME people reside in social sciences. They don't. They actually reside in STEM subjects. And what becomes really interesting is the lack of proliferation of those individuals at higher levels. So, for example, there is in all of the subject disciplines, there are more BAME students with PhDs in STEM subjects than they are in any other discipline. Now, traditionally, people would presume straight away that actually no, it'd be social sciences, but it isn't. It's actually in STEM subjects. But where are those STEM academics? Why can you have situations where people are qualified, capably, have published, have brought in funding, but they're still not on academic tenure posts, permanent posts? Why does that happen? I could make a very strong argument that the structure's in place. It's how STEM as a subject, and the social sciences, might I add, define excellence. And that defining of excellence is very, very narrow. And actually what it does is it recognizes excellence through one particular lens, and that particular lens is whiteness. And that completely obscures the idea that people of color could be as capable as their white counterparts, because the perception is the best get to the top, and the best is defined as being white physicians, white engineers. It's symptomatic of the sector, but I think what's important is how we disrupt that. I don't think it's beyond reproach that we could really dismantle this and create a really fair and equal space. One of the stories that I was going to tell, again, was someone that had a PhD in physics at a really well-respected university. And they spoke about this idea of every day when they go to work, they apply their makeup twice. So they said to me, Jason, I know you love music. So I was like, yeah, and I think everyone knows that. And they're like, and I know you like REM. So I was like, yeah. They're like, do you know the song called Imitation of Life? So I said, yeah. I said, you know that line in it, no one can see me cry? So I was like, yeah, I know that line. And they're like, well, basically, I apply my makeup in the morning. I go in, I know I'm going to encounter racism. Invariably, I always encounter it. I go into the toilet, I cry, I get it out of my system, I lock myself in, and no one can see me cry. I'm sat on the toilet seat and I'm reapplying my makeup in this small mirror. That's my armor. I come back out, I take a deep breath to engage in this process again. And this happens 2 or 3 times a week, and it has done for 7 years. Now, that particular individual, for all of their, the accolades they've had, the institutions they've studied at, for their absolute excellence in the area of physics, they don't work in the academy anymore because it was something they couldn't do every day. And this person's 31 years old. You could make an argument their career hasn't even begun. In terms of, we know the longevity of academic careers, 60 and beyond, but they've left the academy with all of that promise. And we can't afford to lose some of the best talents in academia across any subject discipline who do come from BAME backgrounds, equally as much as people come from white backgrounds. We can't afford to lose these types of individuals in the academy. Universities are always positioned as a microcosm of society. What we need to ensure is that our institutions, our higher education institutions, are reflective of the multicultural, multi-ethnic society that we reside in, because presently they don't. And that's across all of society's major institutions. But higher education is one of those institutions, and we all need to think about how we can move this forward. Now, I'm an eternal optimist, and I've always believed that we can change this, but to change it, there has to be a collation of hearts and minds that are aligned. And I think we're at a really critical juncture in our race relations history, not only nationally, but globally. And I think this is a really seminal time for us to go beyond being kind of twitching fingers and be this collective fist that really looks to penetrate the walls of structural inequality, not just in relation to racism, even though that's what I'm talking about today, intersectionally. You know, we're living in a university culture where sexual harassment, as an example, has become normative. To the extent that reporting procedures at universities, to be honest, facilitate men to behave inappropriately and in a way where there is no punishment for that. So it's about thinking about, you know, how we challenge all of these structures to ensure that we're creating a space where all people feel safe, a sense of belonging, a sense of being heard, and really a sense of connectedness that comes from recognizing that we are all different, and we embrace that difference and use it as a strength to mobilize what could be an intellectually and multiculturally stimulating space. It's always an absolute buzz to have opportunities like this. I don't proclaim to know everything. I don't, far from it. The only thing I try and do is to try and mobilize change with a collective of good people. And I feel like today I'm in really good company. And I think, in my humble opinion, that as an institution, to have people like Alex at the fore leading work like this is, you are unbelievably lucky, in my opinion. But Alex is a woman of colour, and the labour that women of colour exhaust doing this endeavour is wrong. And I say it's wrong because it's a collective endeavour. Alex should be supported in doing this. You know, the burden of this work always falls on women of colour. And I think it's important for all of us, including men of colour, who have profited also from the work of women of colour, to support in doing this work as collective endeavour. So Alex, thank you so much for having me here. Honestly, you're amazing, and I just feel really privileged to be here. So thank you so much.
Oh, that was really touching. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. It was very sobering. But, you know, I think we always have to hear these things, even though they're unpleasant, because otherwise, like, if you don't know, how can you change? I have so many questions for you, and I can see questions coming in. So I thought I would start and ask one of my questions first, because, you know, as the host, I get that luxury. So there's kind of several things you touched on that hopefully I'll be able to come back to some of my questions. But you just now spoke about the fact that a lot of the time the burden for doing this extra work does fall on people of color, and particularly pushing forward the work on racism. We do tend to drive a lot of that because, you know, we have to. So my question is basically about yourself. Like, do you feel like this burden gets put on you a lot? Obviously, in your job as, you know, an expert on racism, I know you work with lots of universities on their approach to racism, but like, do you feel this burden yourself to like try and make the change? And like, how do you handle that? Like, how do you not get overwhelmed by it? Because sometimes it can get like it's a lot, right?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. That's a great question. I mean, it's a weird situation, I guess, for me, because my friends all joke like you'll never meet a more reluctant academic, purely because like when it wasn't that long ago that I was teaching physical education, and 8 years ago, I was saying this to a friend the other day. When I was doing my PhD and working full time, I had weekend jobs at Tesco and Sainsbury's and was cleaning toilets. So I never thought I'd ever be in a position where I would then now be an associate professor and an executive, a deputy executive dean that leads this work in my institution. I think one thing that helps is, I know change is really slow, but I feel like something is happening, and that in itself, there's an intrinsic motivation there, because you kind of feel like you have to do your bit. Now, I guess I never asked to be in a position of responsibility in terms of leading this agenda forward or being part of an amazing generation of academics that have done that. But I think the most important thing is what you do with that responsibility. And I think that it's a privilege to be in that position where you can advance change. I think the most important thing is how you do it. Who do you bring along with you? How do you ensure that all voices are heard? How do you ensure that people are mobilized to cultivate and to change things in a way that isn't exploitative or exhaustive of people of color, particularly women of color? And as a black man, I'm keenly aware that there are privileges that I have over women of color that afford me unfair privileges. And it's really thinking about how I challenge and reflect on that all the time, and my positionality becomes important in that. So for me, the great thing about being a school teacher is that everything was about praxis, the theory of something and the practice of something. And the absence of that in higher education is a really interesting thing. So I think people are very good at theorizing things, but not always very good at the practical element of it. Because the theorizing is kind of easy in some respects. The doing is difficult. And the doing is what's always been placed on women of colour, people of colour. It's always, the burden's been on them to do the doing. And I think a big part of doing that work is recognizing it's going to be difficult. I think, thank God, I think I've got a good temperament for it, which helps. But I also know, because of the amount of people I've interviewed, what it's done to them over a 10, 20, 30, 40-year period. And so I'd always made a conscious decision that in a couple of years' time, in 4 years' time, my daughter will be 18. And I would always make a decision that at that point, it'd be a good time to call it a day, because I don't want it to consume me in the way it's consumed other people. And also because there's a generation of amazing people coming through that are doing amazing things. And it's about creating space for people to take that charge forward and to really kind of penetrate and disrupt racism through new guises, new interventions, new forms, new instruments of anti-racism. And I think that's really important. So the thing I always know is that you're keeping the seat warm for someone, and someone else will take over, and then they'll do it better, and then the next person will come and they'll do it better. But when I say the word better means a collective endeavor, not just people of color trying to extricate themselves from a structure of supremacy that they never created in the first place.
Thank you. Yeah. Boy. Sorry. Just like this whole conversation is just like, I have so many things I want to say, and it's like,
Alex, please, honestly, please say it. I think these things. I want to hear what you have to say, and I think your experience as a woman of colour will be very different to mine. So please, I would love to hear what you have to say.
Well, one of the things that I feel is like a tricky line with this is like, on the one hand, as people who are, the victims in the system, you don't want to have to be doing all the work yourself. But then I think there's this other side of it where you also don't want the people who benefit from the system to be making the decisions and to be saying, oh, this is how we're going to change. So I feel like one thing I keep encountering, and it's actually, I feel like I'd like to hear your opinion on it, is in a lot of the discussions I have, I keep saying, so why don't we pay people for this work? Why don't we pay people for the work? So that, even if you're suffering from the effects of structural racism, if we're asking you to do work to try and change it, the least we can do is acknowledge that it's work and pay you. And like, do you have a thought on payment for doing things like ED&I work?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is people don't get paid for EDI work, and it's my belief is I personally am not motivated by money, but I think in life when anybody pays for something, there's a valuing of it. There's a value. If we go to the shop right now and we spend, I don't know, 5 bags on a pair of shoes, it's because we value it. The value comes in the fact that it's something that one wants, right? And I think that ED&I work in higher education institutions and society more generally isn't valued. It's seen as goodwill.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, people don't recognize the currency and the value in that. Because I think for a lot of white people, it's an add-on. It's not something that's particularly important, because the challenging or the mobilization of EDI and recognizing it by fiscally underpinning it means that it's going to disrupt a culture and a space, an unequal space that in all honesty, white people do profit from. They gain from being in that unequal space. If there are a lot of white people, if everything became equal tomorrow, I think they would suffer. They would suffer, because I think for people of color, they have to work twice as hard to occupy space. And part of that is the expectation that they should be doing EDI work. And because they're a person of color, or because they're within the intersection, you're passionate about it. You shouldn't be paid to do your passion, and universities and people exploit that. And I always feel that when people are offering a service, something that is of currency to an institution, that they should be paid for it. And what we've observed is, like I said, the majority of this work is done by women of colour, and they've never been paid for it, and they're not remunerated for it fiscally or reputationally. And when it comes to progressing through our institution, shock horror, when you look at the criteria to get promoted, the university has kind of allocated them time to be an EDI, to do EDI work. But when it comes to promotion and you talk about citizenship, universities don't include that within their promotion criteria. So it's thankless, is a thankless task that isn't remunerated, isn't rewarded, takes up a lot of time, and actually moves away from the currency that universities reward, which often white people are in a position to profit from, which is research, bringing in research grants and working as part of research teams. Now, for most people of color, they don't have access to those types of networks. One, because of how these spaces work, and two, because the whole time they're spending doing EDI stuff, not being remunerated for. So I always think institutions should do that. They have the money to do it, but what they're doing is they're basically to go all South London, they're taking liberties. That's what they're doing. They're taking liberties, and they know they're doing it, and they know that they can threaten people with employment for not doing it. And along a flawed workload model, they can come around and say things like, within this 550 hours, you actually have time within that. You have allocated time to do that, which we all know is tosh. That doesn't work like that. And if that's the case, why are people of color always burdened with so many administrative duties and tasks in comparison to their white counterparts at the same grade and at the same level? Now, if someone can answer me those questions, that's great. But I feel like there is no answer that someone can give me that I'd be willing to listen to, because I've not only have I seen it, I've experienced it myself. So, and that is one of the biggest criticisms that many people of colour said. I'm on the same pay grade, but I seem to have more marking, more administrative responsibilities, and it's all of these things. And I think it's convenient for people to obscure that from discussions and to say, well, it's EDI work. We're giving you agency by you doing it. You shouldn't. You want to dismantle racial inequality. You shouldn't be paid to do that. And then the gaslighting happens. Like, okay, so as a person of color who's encountering racism, I didn't create this. I didn't ask to encounter racism, but you want me to solve the problem. You also want me to do the work, and you want me to be gracious about it and not say anything about it as well. Like, it's the most ridiculous system. I don't want to curse. It's the most ridiculous system one could imagine. And the thing is, when we apply it to other intersections, for example, like gender work within higher education institutions is often fiscally rewarded. Case in point, Athena Swan. Athena Swan is an intervention that is funded, and institutions provide contributions in kind or match funding to support that endeavour. Now, when we think about who Athena Swan has benefited, it's a fantastic intervention. But let's be specific about who it's benefited. It's benefited white middle-class women. It hasn't benefited white working-class women, and it damn sure hasn't benefited women of colour. So let's be accurate when we're talking about that. And we know that from the statistics in terms of pay and the huge pay differentials between white middle-class women and women of colour, and white working-class women as well.
Thank you. You said a lot of things that rang very true. I'm going to delve into the questions so that people feel like I'm asking their questions as well, not just my own. So here's a question that I think ties in really nicely with what we've just been talking about. And it's, how do people who aren't empowered in the current system help to deconstruct? Like, how can we try and change things, I guess?
I think it comes back to the E word, educating yourself. I think there are a lot of dynamics around gender that I've spent the best part of a decade trying to understand how my presence as a male impacts those factors, particularly along the intersection. And I think educating oneself is really important. I think getting comfortable with the uncomfortable is a really important thing. And I think it's the recognizing of privilege. We can all learn. I think it's kind of going, there's these kind of, in becoming anti-racist, there's these kind of zones of proximity. There's the fear zone, there's a zone of comfort, and then there's the zone of understanding and implementation. And I think for a lot of people, that fear zone is almost a reluctance to accept racism exists. That comfort zone is you're challenging aspects of you understand that racism exists, but you're not doing enough to challenge it and disrupt it. When you get into that third zone, that becomes really, really important because then you learn that understanding of, okay, how do I disrupt these spaces? How do I challenge racism? How do I engage in white allyship that doesn't center me as a white person, centers people of color, but I'm still able to use my privilege to disrupt acts of racism or racial microaggression towards my colleague of color. And all of that for me comes from educating. And also, there's a patience on the other side of that that needs to recognize that people are at different stages of this learning journey, and people will arrive at particular types of understandings around race and racism at different times. And one thing I would say with people of color, which has been time immemorial, that they've always been patient and they've always been, very gracious, because to engage in racist encounters every day and to show restraint really shows the temperament you need to negotiate those situations. And that's a really difficult thing amongst all the other intersections that they may be managing. So for me, it's about how we reconceptualize white allyship. The murder of George Floyd has allowed us to have a brief pause, reflexive pause, about how we engage in white allyship. And it's to recognize that the work of being a white ally can't be seasonal. There can't be a seasonal approach. So in other words, do you know what? Summer's looking good. I'm going to take the summer off. I'll probably take off autumn, but then I'll get back on it in winter and probably spring. It's got to be all 4 seasons, because the other side of that is that people of color don't have the luxury of saying, do you know what? I don't feel like encountering racism this season. So I'll take it off, and then it's part of their lived existence. So being on that journey is literally kind of engaging in a ride or die capacity. You've got to be with that person all the time. And it's really, really, and when I say all the time, I mean it metaphorically, in terms of being in those spaces and disrupting it and learning what white allyship is, not through asking a person of color, what can I do, but by observing, by educating, by reading. Once you've engaged in that process, then you can speak to a person of color and say, how else can I be of support? And I think it comes from that basis of education, which forms a basis of understanding and acknowledges that as a white person, you're willing to do the work rather than ask and place more labor on people of color and say, what can I do to help? Because that is a really short circuit solution, and it's quite lazy. It's lazy anti-racism, to be honest. It's about educating oneself. In terms of sexism, I don't go to women and say to women, what can we do? What can men do to help? No, I try and do my education first. Think about how men, behave in ways that are completely abhorrent. And then I do that work. I sit with that uncomfortability. I learn, and then I ask from a position of understanding and knowledge, what can I do to disrupt male patriarchy? And I use that as an example because I always try and talk with people, not at people.
Thank you. Sorry, we've got so many questions. I'm trying to pick one. Sorry, it's really stressful. So I saw one that isn't really a question, but I kind of want to say it. And someone has said here, what about physics? And so number one, I'm not entirely sure what they're asking about physics. But I'm going to interpret it how I want to interpret it. And what I want to say is that whilst Jason is an expert in sociology and racism, I think it's fair to say you're not an expert in physics and you don't work in the physics department.
my 2 F's in science ain't going to help you on this one.
Well, I just wanted to briefly talk about what I think about physics. And from looking around, for instance, Oxford's physics department, it is predominantly white. And I think coming back to what Jason said, it's not a question of people of color not having the qualifications or not being good enough to be in the department. There's clearly other factors at work, and they are structural racism. One of the things that I would personally like to see more in our department is more people of color being invited for talks, occupying more space in the department. Like, we obviously can't overnight just hire loads of people, as much as I would like. It's not going to happen. But for me, the thing I would really like to see from people in the department is holding other people accountable, because it's a cultural thing as much as it is a structural thing. Like, every single thing that we let go, every single little instance that you might observe as a white person, which you think, oh, that wasn't okay, it's up to you to use your privilege to call people out and to hold people accountable and to make the environment better for people. Because it's not just a case of not having people of color in the department, it's the fact that, like, perhaps the environment isn't pleasant. And this again goes back to something that you said, that, you know, sometimes you're there, you're trying your hardest, and you're dealing with the microaggressions or just like the outright racism, and we need our white allies to step up and say, no, you don't have to deal with this. I will tell this person why they're wrong, and I will hold them accountable, and I will make the complaint. So even though this person asked a question that I don't really understand what the question was, I think I've answered it.
Great.
Okay. Sorry, we're supposed to be hearing from you, not from me.
No, Alex, it's brilliant.
Okay, this is an interesting one. So the question is, if you're as a white passing but still person who would be categorized as BAME, do you personally believe that if you're white passing, you still experience acts of systemic racism in your employment, or is there a different form of racism that white passing but people of color experience?
I think that's a great question. I mean, probably the obvious answer is that there is a proximity to whiteness, and based on how colorism works and how colonialism works, that there are preferences. But I think that it is important that we don't neutralize the experiences of people that are considered white passing. And the reason why I say that is because they will have had to encounter being biracial and really trying to identify spaces of belonging in a way that actually, in some cases, maybe people who are black passing, if that's a term, wouldn't have to, because there's that kind of sense of, in some respects, being nomadic, not having a place where you belong, because in some respects white people kind of look at you and can think, there's something slightly different about you, which can kind of really facilitate this really bizarre fetishization. There's an exoticism, all of these kind of fetish words which just I can only describe it with sound, and it's not to if I'm being absolutely honest, I think black women more than any other race encounter racism in a way that is very, very unique and hostile. So it's not about a hierarchy of experience, but it's important to say that, because I think the absence of not saying that is one, quite insensitive, and it's quite obtruse to not acknowledge something like that. But I do think that there is this idea that people who are white passing don't experience racism in the same way. And I think that we need to be careful of doing that. We need to be careful of segregating, and we don't want to homogenize, but we also don't want to suggest that people that there's almost like a level of racial experience. I think it's very unique to the individual, and I think that we need to be careful of suggesting that because someone is white passing or has a proximity to whiteness, they somehow encounter less racism. I try not to speak about being another. I try not to speak for someone's shoes I haven't been in before. I don't know what it's like to be in that situation, and I would imagine having a dad that is biracial, that actually there are, well, I know for a fact there are a lot of issues in terms of a sense of non-belonging from both sides. So I think that's kind of really important to acknowledge that, and to recognize that there is something in political correctness as a movement, and that movement is inclusive of people of color. And being white passing, it's one of those terms that I never really like, because I think that can actually be a neutralizer in terms of how someone experiences racism. And I say that because basically, because they may be perceived as white passing, for that individual, they may feel in certain spaces that I can't talk about being racialized, and that is stifling. That is stifling, and I think people of color who encounter racism should always be given a platform to talk about their racialized experiences, with society and all of us recognizing that people experience racism in many different ways in terms of people of color. So I think that's really important. But I also caveat that by saying, you know, Black women in particular do encounter racism in a very violent and systemic and unique way that I don't actually think is comparable. And I think that's important to say.
That was, yeah, a really great answer. I felt very spoken to through a lot of that answer, because this is definitely something that I think I encounter, because I don't really look that brown, I guess.
Yeah.
So here's a question that I find interesting to think about. Do you think that affirmative action or something similar is a tool that universities in the UK should implement, having seen the effects of it in the US?
Alex, should I say something really funny? As soon as you said affirmative, I was like, I was just like, just stop the question right there. One, if there is one thing I would bring into the UK, it would be affirmative action. And we don't have it. Our equivalent of affirmative action is positive action, and I can't think of a legislation that we make more poor use of than that. If positive action was used effectively in higher education, there is a lot we could do to diversify the space and create a more equal space, but we don't. We use it selectively, and there's an ambiguity with it that is applied by a lot of white senior leaders, that it in fact doesn't benefit people of color, and they could use it to do that. You know, you can have BAME PhD studentships, you can have you know, selection panels or shortlist panels, like where you make a conscious effort to have better BAME representation, not only on the recruitment panels but also on the shortlisting. There are things that you can do, and we don't utilize positive action enough. But if I personally had my own way, I would have affirmative action. I would think, this is probably the most arrogant thing I'll ever say, and I'm not an arrogant person, but I would be one of the biggest advocates in higher education for affirmative action. I think that is the way to go. I think sometimes there are times where to accelerate change, you have to force the issue on certain things, and I would do that because the disaggregation that people of color face in the academy in terms of pay, progression, wider representation, being in positions of leadership, that is never going to change if we sit with the current system we've got now. It will be like that in 10 years' time. And that's not me being pessimistic. Things will improve, but they're only as effective as the type of leaderships, type of leaders you have, the types of institutions you have, the types of people that are incumbent, the types of custodians of the academy that reside within it, the gatekeepers to knowledge. You know, it's about changing all of that. And the only way to really do it, because there is a reluctance by a lot of white people to give up that privilege, is to in some respects, I wouldn't say forcibly, but when you're talking about affirmative action, there is something that is quite forcible about it. And I think that is an intervention that is needed in the UK. Otherwise, there'll be 101 culture reviews, there'll be 101 racial reports. You know, we'll be talking about Macpherson report not 22 years later, 40 years later, and still using the same terms. We made fragile gains since the offering of that report. And I don't want us to use that kind of lexicon anymore. I want us to actually make tangible structural changes. And I do think affirmative action will facilitate that massively.
Yeah. I've always felt that part of the reason there's such a pushback to the idea of having affirmative action in the UK is not, it's also ties into our like weird class system. I feel like it's not just, there's like the class elements and then like the racism elements and then obviously like the sexism and anything else that ties into it.
I mean, I would, to be honest, I would apply it across the intersection. I wouldn't just advocate that for race. I'd apply that across the intersection, you know. But yeah, I mean, I would particularly focus on race because our major institutions are pretty much all entirely white. So, for obvious reasons, I'm not white, so I would push for that.
Yeah, that's very
Yeah, so
um, yeah. Um, there's a question here that I really want to ask because even though it's a slight deviation, it actually ties into something that I've been hearing a lot about. Do you think the term BAME can be damaging? Because you're essentially lumping together all non-white people and treating them equally. And when you do things like break down the statistics, for instance, you could say, oh, 40% of our staff are BAME, but actually only 1% is Black. And so what are your thoughts on catch-all terms like BAME, like BIPOC, for instance? That's a
yeah, I think catch-all terms like BAME are hugely problematic, and in every piece of writing I've ever done, I've always had to put a footnote saying that this term is problematic. But in policy documents and in policy interventions, it's still the term that the government prefers to use. And there hasn't been anything in parliamentary spaces in Whitehall to suggest that that is going to change anytime soon. I mean, the operative word being Whitehall. So I think the homogenizing of ethnic minorities is problematic, which is why I prefer terms like either just saying Black and minority ethnic people or people of color. And there is a homogenizing of those experiences, which always paints a picture that, you know, amongst Black and ethnic minority people or BAME people, their outcomes aren't as bad as they suggest because there's that grouping. But when you kind of separate the kind of the fat from the strain, what you do see is that within those particular groups, they experience things very, very differently. So, for example, how the comparison is drawn between Black African and Black Caribbean. There's huge distinct profiles in terms of academic outcomes. When we think amongst South Asian communities, and we think particularly around, you know, Indian, Bangladeshi, and Pakistani, between Bangladeshi and Pakistani, um, against Indian, there are huge, you know, Indian, you know, Pakistani people from Pakistani and Bangladeshi backgrounds tend to have lower educational attainment. But when it's lumped together, it can present this like whole holistic picture, particularly when we talk about Asian, because then we're also talking about East Asian, which can kind of compound that as well. And then when we talk about people from Romani and traveler groups, again, that's a completely unique experience because there is still a proximity to whiteness, but individuals from that diaspora are a racial group or an ethnic group. So it's recognizing kind of the differences and not using those terms and really moving beyond the laziness of engaging in that as a homogeneous activity. It's recognizing they're not subtle nuances, they are quite big nuances between those ethnic categories. And I think the more we engage in language that recognizes that, the better. Otherwise, what we're doing is subverting everyone's experience to be the same. And that isn't the case because, you know, like I said, of 30,000 PhD studentships awarded, only 30 were awarded to Black British Caribbean people. That is remarkable. That is remarkable. And by the way, the number for the amount of Black studentships that were awarded to Black people, predominantly from African backgrounds, is not much more than that. So it's something like 100. So you're still talking about, you know, still a pathetic number out of 30,000 when you bear in mind that in that particular year, the majority, you know, to just over half of the applications, according to HESA, because we've got a Freedom of Information Act, over half of the applications for Black and ethnic minority came from Black and ethnic minority people in relation to gaining PhD studentship places. So even though this information isn't accessible, Black people and ethnic minority people are still finding ways to apply for these programs. I mean, if someone can explain to me why you have that volume of people applying and only 30 Black Caribbeans are deemed worthy enough to have that over 30,000 people, I'm all ears.
well, that's yeah, wow. Those numbers are just awful, right? They're just
Yeah, and the thing is, like I said, I mean, I said I don't have a benign obsession with numbers. It probably seems like I do, but sadly, to illustrate where we are, very often you have to, you know, you have to kind of prophesize what these numbers are, because I think, you know, a lot of people don't have an understanding of just how bad it is, you know. But I also think that by having these conversations, what we have seen is a C-section and a change in how we are conceptualizing and understanding this context. And I do think as a result, we are going to see greater change in the next couple of years. I think we're beginning to see it now. You know, the OFS have responded to the Broken Pipeline report, and as a result, now there's that huge bid that's kind of coming out in terms of mobilizing Black and ethnic minority opportunities at PGR level, particularly doctoral level.
Well, I feel like that was a slight optimism for which we can end our talk on. So thank you so much, Jason. This has been sobering, but really great to have you here talking. And I know this is probably like the first time in the department anyone's gone into this in such depth. And so I'm really happy that we could have you here to do it. Thank you everyone for attending. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will be putting it on YouTube when we've had time. So yeah, thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great day.
And Alex, you're brilliant. Just thank you so much, and everyone, like, literally live well, and I hope everyone's well, and much love, and take care everyone. Thank you so much, Alex.
Thanks.